After years of living in the bustling city, Brian was ready for a change. The relentless noise, crowded streets, and ceaseless pace of urban life had worn him down. When he came across an online listing for a spacious duplex at a ridiculously low rent, he didn't think twice. Nestled on the outskirts of a sleepy town, the property looked perfect. The move was swift, and by the end of his first day, Brian was surrounded by boxes in his new living room. The duplex was quaint but slightly eerie. Its walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floors creaked with every step. The landlord, a gruff older man named Mr. Howard, had mentioned the adjoining unit was vacant. "Hasn't been rented in years," Mr. Howard said with a shrug when handing over the keys. "But don't worry, it's perfectly fine." Brian liked the idea of having no immediate neighbors. It meant peace and quiet, something he had craved for years. That night he slept soundly, the first truly restful sleep he'd had in months. But the tranquility didn't last long. The next morning, as he sipped his coffee on the back porch, he noticed something odd. A faint light flickered in the window of the supposedly empty adjoining unit. Brian stared, unsure if he had imagined it. Shaking it off as a trick of the morning sun, he went about his day. He spent hours unpacking, arranging furniture, and getting to know his new home. By evening, he felt a sense of accomplishment and decided to treat himself to a beer. As he settled into his couch, ready to enjoy his newfound solitude, he heard it. Faint footsteps overhead. His brow furrowed. The duplex was supposed to be unoccupied. "Old houses make noises," he muttered to himself, brushing it off. But deep down, unease began to creep in. Over the next few days, strange occurrences began to pile up. Brian would hear faint sounds late at night. Footsteps, whispers, the creak of a door opening or closing. Once he even thought he heard muffled laughter. Determined to prove to himself that he was imagining things, Brian decided to inspect the adjoining unit. If someone had moved in without him knowing, he wanted to meet them. He grabbed the spare key Mr. Howard had given him and walked over. The front door was locked, just as it should have been. Brian unlocked it and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and abandonment. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners like drapes. The unit was clearly uninhabited. He wandered through the rooms, his footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. Everything was as one would expect from a place that had been vacant for years, except for one door. At the end of the hallway was a door that stood slightly ajar. The air around it felt colder, almost oppressive. Brian hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He pushed it open cautiously, revealing a small empty room. Its walls were bare, and the wooden floor was warped from moisture. Relieved but still unsettled, Brian left the unit, locking the door behind him. But as he stepped back into his side of the duplex, he noticed something chilling. The light in the adjoining unit flickered on once more. That night, Brian lay in bed, unable to sleep. His mind raced with possibilities. Was someone sneaking into the adjoining unit? Was Mr. Howard hiding something about the property? The following morning, Brian decided to confront the landlord. He drove to Mr. Howard's office only to find it closed with a "back soon" sign taped to the door. Frustrated, he returned home. When he stepped inside, he immediately noticed something out of place. A small, folded piece of paper sat on his kitchen counter. He hadn't left it there. Unfolding it cautiously, he read the message scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Stop looking." A chill ran down his spine. Someone had been in his home. Panic set in as he checked every lock and window, ensuring everything was secure. He even called the police, who took his statement and promised to patrol the area. But the nights only grew worse. More notes appeared, on his bathroom mirror, on his pillow, even inside his fridge. Each message was more unsettling than the last. "You're not alone. It's watching. Leave before it's too late." Brian's breaking point came when he woke up to find his bedroom door wide open. He always closed and locked it before bed, yet there it was, swinging gently in the draft. He grabbed a flashlight and decided to search both units thoroughly, this time armed with a kitchen knife. The adjoining unit was as empty as before, but the air felt heavier, as if he were being watched. Then he heard it, a soft whisper, just behind him. Whipping around, flashlight in hand, he saw nothing. But the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. It wasn't words but a sound, a guttural, inhuman noise that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Terrified, Brian fled back to his unit, locking every door and window. He spent the rest of the night sitting on his couch, knife clutched tightly in his hand. Desperate for answers, Brian decided to dig into the history of the duplex. He spent hours at the local library, poring over old records and newspaper clippings. What he found was horrifying. The duplex had a dark past. Decades ago, a man had lived there with his wife and young daughter. Rumors swirled about abuse and neglect, but nothing was ever proven. One night, the wife and daughter disappeared. The man claimed they had left him, but neighbors reported strange noises coming from the house at night. Screams, crying, and frantic knocking. Eventually, the man vanished too, leaving the house abandoned for years. Locals avoided it, claiming it was cursed. Armed with this knowledge, Brian returned home, determined to leave as soon as possible. But as he packed his belongings, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps once again, this time coming from his own living room. Brian stepped out of his bedroom cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. The living room was empty, but the air was thick with tension. He grabbed his car keys and made his way to the door, only to find it locked from the inside. The whispers began again, louder this time, surrounding him. Shadows danced on the walls, taking on grotesque, twisted forms. "Leave," a voice growled, deep and menacing. With a surge of adrenaline, Brian threw himself at the door, breaking it open. He ran to his car and sped away, not stopping until he reached the city. Brian never returned to the duplex. Weeks later, he learned it had been demolished after a fire destroyed most of the structure. He never found out what had truly haunted the property, but the memories of the whispers and shadows stayed with him, a reminder that some places are better left alone. Samantha had just moved into her quaint little house on the outskirts of town. She had been seeking solace after a messy breakup and hoped this secluded neighborhood would bring her peace. Surrounded by dense woods and far from the bustling city, the house had a charm she couldn't resist. Her first night there was uneventful. She unpacked some boxes, arranged her furniture, and admired the serenity of her new home. But as night fell and the quiet grew deeper, she began to feel the weight of her isolation. Still, the soft chirping of crickets outside her window was a soothing reminder that she wasn't entirely alone. By the second night, Samantha was already feeling more at ease. After dinner, she curled up on the couch to watch her favorite TV series. Around 10 p.m., just as the protagonist on screen faced their own perilous moment, Samantha heard it. A loud knock at her front door. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a casual knock, it was firm, deliberate, and echoed through the silence of the house. She paused the show and waited, hoping she had imagined it. A minute passed, then another. Nothing. Dismissing it as her mind playing tricks on her, she returned to the couch. But just as she pressed play, the knock came again, this time louder and more insistent. Samantha's pulse quickened. She tiptoed to the door, peeking through the peephole. Outside, the porch was bathed in the faint glow of the motion-activated light, but there was no one there. She opened the door cautiously, scanning the empty yard. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The only reply was the rustling of leaves in the cool night breeze. The knocking became a nightly occurrence. At first, Samantha convinced herself it was kids playing pranks. After all, she was new to the neighborhood, and small towns were known for their odd characters. But each night the knocks grew louder, more aggressive, and always at the same time, 10 p.m. sharp. On the fifth night, she decided to set up her phone to record the front porch. If it was kids, she'd have evidence to confront them, or maybe even take it to the local police. She spent that night in her bedroom, unable to relax. Sure enough, at exactly 10 p.m., the knocking began. It echoed through the house, and despite her closed bedroom door, she could feel the vibrations in her chest. The next morning, she eagerly checked her phone, expecting to find some teenager caught red-handed. What she saw sent chills down her spine. The video showed the porch light flickering as if someone was walking through the sensor's range, but no figure appeared. The knocking, however, was unmistakable, loud and clear. Yet the porch remained empty, the camera capturing nothing but an empty view of her yard. Her hands trembled as she replayed the footage, hoping she had missed something. But the video was the same every time, knocks with no visible source. By the second week, Samantha was sleeping less and less. Every knock felt like a taunt, a reminder that she was completely alone in this house. She started keeping all the lights on, hoping to deter whoever or whatever was responsible. One evening, as she stared out of her window, she noticed movement at the edge of the woods. A shadow flitted between the trees, moving closer to her house. She squinted, trying to make out its form, but it was too dark. Grabbing her flashlight, she stepped out onto the porch. "Who's there?" she called, her voice echoing in the still night. The shadow paused, just beyond the reach of the beam, then darted back into the trees. Shaking, Samantha returned inside and locked the door. She spent the rest of the night clutching a kitchen knife, unable to shake the feeling that she was being watched. The next morning, she found footprints leading from the woods to her porch. They were large, barefoot prints, pressed deep into the soil as if made by something heavy. Samantha's fear reached its peak when the knocking stopped altogether. For 2 nights there was silence, and she began to hope that the nightmare was over. But on the third night, something far worse happened. She was awakened by a loud crash downstairs. Heart pounding, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911 as she crept toward the stairs. The operator's calm voice tried to reassure her, but Samantha could hardly focus. From the top of the staircase, she saw the source of the crash. Her living room window had been shattered. Glass shards littered the floor, and the cold night air poured into the room. But it wasn't just the broken window that terrified her. Standing in the middle of the living room was a figure. It was tall, its body shrouded in darkness, and its face was hidden beneath a hood. The figure turned its head slowly, as if sensing her presence. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as it began to ascend the stairs, each step deliberate and heavy. Samantha ran to her bedroom, slamming the door shut and locking it. She pushed her dresser against the door, her hands shaking so badly that she could barely move. The intruder pounded on the door, each thud sending vibrations through the room. "Leave me alone!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She listened, her ear pressed against the door, but all she could hear was her own ragged breathing. A moment later, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police had arrived. When the officers searched the house, they found no one. The figure had vanished, leaving behind only the shattered window and a single muddy footprint on the stairs. Samantha moved out the following week, unable to stay in the house any longer. She rented a small apartment in the city, far from the woods and the eerie isolation of her old home. For a while, she felt safe. The noise of the city was a comfort, drowning out the memories of the knocks and the shadowy figure. But one night, as she prepared for bed, her phone buzzed with a text. It was an image of her old house taken from the woods. Beneath it was a single line of text: "I miss our visits." Emily had always enjoyed her solitude. Living alone in a quiet suburb, she found peace in her independence. Her evenings were spent curled up with a good book, a warm cup of tea, and the gentle hum of her favorite jazz records. But that peace was shattered one cold November night. The first sign that something was wrong came just after 11 p.m. Emily had been reading in her living room when she heard a faint knock at her front door. It wasn't the polite rhythm of a neighbor stopping by, but a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. Peering through the peephole, she saw no one. Brushing it off as the wind or a mischievous kid, She returned to her book. But 10 minutes later, the knocking came again, this time louder, more insistent. Her heart raced as she double-checked the locks on her door. Something felt off. The street outside was eerily silent, the lamplight casting long shadows on the pavement. Deciding not to engage, she turned off her lights and retreated to her bedroom, hoping the visitor, whoever it was, would go away. As she climbed into bed, her phone buzzed with a text. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "Why won't you answer the door?" Her breath caught in her throat. She looked around her dark room, the glow of her phone the only source of light. How did they get her number? Who was this person? Unable to sleep, Emily stayed awake, her ears straining for any sound. Hours passed, and just as she began to convince herself that she'd imagined the text, her phone buzzed again. This time, the message was a picture. It was her house, taken from just outside her living room window. Emily's blood ran cold. She lived on a quiet street, far from the main road. Her house was surrounded by a small garden with tall hedges. Whoever had taken the picture had to have been mere feet from her window. Grabbing a kitchen knife for protection, she crept to the window and peered through the curtains. The garden was empty, the faint glow of the streetlights illuminating nothing but bushes and trees. Her phone buzzed again. Another picture, this time of her bedroom window. Panic surged through her. She rushed to turn off her bedroom light, plunging the room into darkness. She checked all her windows, ensuring they were locked, before dialing 911. The operator assured her that officers were on their way, but as Emily hung up, another text arrived. "The police won't help you." Minutes felt like hours as Emily waited for the police to arrive. She sat in the corner of her bedroom, gripping the knife tightly, her eyes darting to every shadow. Then she heard it, a faint creak of the floorboards. Someone was inside. She held her breath, her pulse pounding in her ears. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving closer to her bedroom. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body was frozen in fear. The doorknob to her room jiggled, and a voice whispered through the door, "Emily, let me in." Tears streamed down her face as she whispered a silent prayer. The doorknob stopped moving, and for a moment there was silence. Then a loud bang echoed through the house. The sound of the front door being forced open. Emily's phone buzzed again. She hesitated but opened the message. It was a video. The footage showed a man dressed in black, standing in her living room, holding a crowbar. The text below read, "Run if you want to live." Emily bolted for the window. Throwing it open, she climbed out onto the roof. Her house wasn't tall, but the jump to the ground was enough to twist her ankle as she landed. Ignoring the pain, she limped to her neighbor's yard, praying they were awake. Behind her, she heard a crash. The intruder had found her bedroom empty. Lights flickered on in her neighbor's house as she banged on their door. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, an elderly couple, opened the door, their faces filled with concern. The Carters let her in and locked the door. Mr. Carter grabbed his shotgun, while Mrs. Carter called the police again. Emily explained the situation in hurried whispers, her voice shaking. Suddenly, the Carters' motion-activated floodlights turned on, illuminating their backyard. The man in black stood just beyond the porch, staring directly at the house. Mr. Carter stepped outside, aiming his shotgun at the figure. "Leave now or I'll shoot," he yelled. The man didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head, as if amused, before stepping back into the shadows. The police arrived moments later, but the intruder was gone. They searched the area but found no trace of him. Emily stayed with the Carters for the night, too shaken to return home. The police promised to increase patrols in the area, but Emily knew she'd never feel safe again. A week later, she moved to a new apartment in the city, far from her old neighborhood. She tried to put the incident behind her, but the nightmares persisted. One evening, as she was unpacking boxes in her new home, her phone buzzed. It was a text from the same unknown number. "Found you.